Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Series. As part of our series, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Jared Ross Hardesty here to talk about his book, Mutiny on the Rising Sun, a tragic tale of slavery, smuggling, and chocolate. Jared Ross Hardesty is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Western Washington University and author of Unfreedom, Slavery and Dependence in 18th Century Boston and Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, A History of Slavery in New England. Jared will be interviewed by Tessa Murphy, Assistant Professor of History at Syracuse University, an expert on the history of the Caribbean and its connections to the greater Atlantic world. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture, but may be submitted at any time in the Q&A. This event is being recorded. Thanks for coming and enjoy the program.
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me to be here today to be in conversation with Dr. Hardesty. I'm going to start because while I had an opportunity to read this fabulous book, oh, it's blurred, this fabulous book recently, I imagine some of you in the audience have not yet had the opportunity. And so I'd like to start by asking you just to give us a brief overview of what your book is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tessa, for agreeing to do this and to interview me. Thank you to the Boston Public Library for having me tonight. This is awesome, one of my favorite institutions in Boston where I've done a lot of research, so it's great to be able to give back a little bit and do this event for them. And I'm very excited to be here. And so, yeah, Mutiny on the Rising Sun, and I don't want to be glib, but it's about a mutiny on the ship, the Rising Sun. And it uses that mutiny, which occurred on the night of June 1st, 1743, off the coast of the Dutch colony of Suriname in South America. It uses that mutiny to tell a bigger story, a story about the significance of smuggling and slavery to early America, to what became the United States. And the reason I'm able to do that is that the mutiny generated this massive documentary record, a trial of the mutineers and what happened to the ship in the aftermath and its cargo in the aftermath. And these records revealed an international cacao, or as we know it in its process form, chocolate smuggling ring. And this smuggling ring used New England ships and New England crews from New England, ship captains and sailors from New England, who would traffic New England produce, salt cod and timber and other agricultural goods, livestock and things like that, and enslaved Africans from the British Empire across imperial lines to Dutch Suriname. This was illegal in the 18th century. It was a form of that's smuggling. It was illegal to cross imperial lines. And so this is it's an international, and they would arrive in Suriname with these goods and purchase a number of commodities. The most important for this smuggling ring was cacao. And then they would take that back to the British West Indian island of Barbados, where it would be sold through Barbados back into the British Empire and be essentially laundered and be quote unquote legal produce once it arrived and was cleared through Barbados. And so ultimately, the records of the mutiny kind of opened a window. It opens a window on a world of smuggling that contemporaries in the 18th century emphatically shut. They did not want people to see what they're up to. They did not want to see this, people to see this illegal trade. But these records open that up for us to see. And what you find when you start digging through all these records and looking into this world of slavery is you find what I call a human history of smuggling. And this is the term I use in the book, that allow me to center the lives of a number of people, of the people who were on board or involved with the Rising Sun, and their experiences of living in a world in which is totally shaped by illicit trade and the existence of slavery. So, for example, in the book, you meet the captain of the ship, a man named Newark Jackson, like Newark, like the city, Jackson, who was the ship captain, and he was from Boston. You meet George Ledane, who's also from Boston, and he was one of the chief organizers of the smuggling ring. He recruited ships and captains in New England to sail to the West Indies and to Suriname to purchase the cacao. You meet a man named Gedney Clark, who, born in Salem, Massachusetts, moved to Barbados and was what I call him the godfather of the smuggling ring. He's the guy who's kind of behind all of this and making it all work. And you meet a man named Edward Tottle, who was from New York, but had spent a significant amount of his life in Boston, and then moved to Suriname, where he served as the smuggling ring's agent on the ground. But it's not just these kind of elite men that you meet in the book. You also meet 15 enslaved people who were on board the Rising Sun. 13 of them were children, and 2 of them were young men. And the thing is, when we think about we talk about this human history of smuggling, sometimes, part of being involved in this world of smuggling was being smuggled. And the Rising Sun, in fact, was an illicit slave trading voyage. It was trafficking upwards of about 50 people from Barbados to Suriname, in addition to other commodities. And so I recount the experience of what these children and young men would have experienced in the book. And you also get to meet the sailors who were on board the ship, including the 3 mutineers whose names were Ferdinand Acosta, Joseph Pereira, and Thomas Lucas, who are described in the documents as either Portuguese sailors or Portuguese Negro sailors. And of the 3, not all of them were Portuguese, and not all of them were of African descent. And so you get to meet them and learn about their backgrounds. And you also get to meet the officers on board the ship, the mate, William Blake, and the boatswain, or boatswain as it's spelled, John Shaw. And the sort of, you get to see the conflict between the crew and what happens in the course of this mutiny, and then its aftermath. And so understanding these sort of lives of the people on board the Rising Sun and the aftermath of this mutiny really kind of helps to show the place and centrality of smuggling and slavery in the kind of rise of American capitalism, is the kind of ultimate conclusion I come to in the book.
Fantastic. Thank you for that description, which, as hopefully the audience could tell, suggests that this is a very lively and eventful book. There's a lot going on there. Your earlier books, which Diane mentioned in the introduction, focused on lesser known histories of slavery in Boston and in New England more generally, and really focused on the lives of everyday people. And I was wondering if you could talk about transitioning to a project rather that, while still focusing very much on a human story, also deals with a much broader Atlantic world. So kind of zooming out from Boston to look at the Atlantic more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. When you sent these questions to me, it was I don't find them difficult, but they're very thoughtful. And so I had to think a bit about this question because it caused me to reassess my own work as an author. And there is a logical progression, right? So I went first book's on Boston, the second book's on New England. So you can kind of see it growing out. And this one's kind of about the Atlantic world as a whole, this kind of international trading system that I describe in the book. And so I think there is that kind of a logical progression there. But one of the things my work has always tried to do, even when I was focused just on Boston in the first book, is I've always tried to talk about slavery in New England in the context of slavery in the wider Atlantic world. So a lot of comparisons with other places, a lot of trying to understand how, the experience of slavery in Boston, say, might be different or similar to in other urban areas of the Americas. This has always been kind of central to my work. And in the second book, I do that as well. I kind of put New England slavery in conversation with, say, the rise of slavery in Virginia and Barbados and places like that. But the other undercurrent of my work, and where it really comes out here, is I've also become really interested in the connections. The connection of Boston, not just to kind of slavery in other parts of America, but to the system of slavery as a whole. If we think about the 18th century Atlantic world, really, and the 17th century as well, it is really, it's a world of slavery. The entire economy is ultimately underpinned through the use of slave labor, growing the valuable commodities of the day, sugar and tobacco and things like that. And so that's the backbone of the economy in the Americas, in the Atlantic. And I became interested in the question of what was, especially Boston's role in this wider world of slavery. And that's what this book tries to do in some ways, is to take a look at the way in which New Englanders and Bostonians become kind of entangled in this wider world of slavery and of smuggling. And so these are really big themes, though, as you said. Like, this is really kind of big picture stuff, to think about slavery as this kind of abstract institution, economic institution, or smuggling as this this kind of omnipresent sort of trading system that's there because of what constituted smuggling in the time period, which is essentially any trade across imperial lines, could be considered illicit unless explicitly condoned. So what that meant was that for this, it's big stuff. It's really big picture. But I was able, the mutiny and the stories of the people who were on board the Rising Sun and involved with it actually allowed me to kind of humanize these really sort of big picture, in some ways abstract ideas. You can kind of put a human face on all of that. So I do go kind of, it is, I was able to kind of engage in that interpersonal history that I was able to do before.
Yeah, and that certainly comes through in the text. You write in your epilogue that you came to this project as a result of Old North Church, and particularly the church's interest in one of their former parishioners, who you've mentioned, Captain Newark Jackson. Can you talk a little bit more about the path to this book for those who may not have had a chance to read the epilogue? Because I think it's just such a great story.
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing for me too, because of how it came about. So when I published Unfreedom in 2016, the Old North Church invited me to give a talk, and I talk about the Old North Church quite a bit in Unfreedom, especially the first rector of Old North, a man by the name of Timothy Cutler. And so when I talk about him, so it wasn't a surprise I was invited. But before the book talk, I'm sitting in the parsonage, and I'm talking to the vicar at the time, a man by the name of Steve Ayres. And Steve asked me, he said, do you know who Newark Jackson is? And I said, who? Who's that? And he said, well, you write about him in your book. Which I said, oh, I did. I did, actually. I used Jackson as an example of an enslaver in Boston. And they started asking me about who Newark Jackson was, what he was up to, and come to find out, they had opened a historic chocolate shop on the Freedom Trail in Boston, and then named it after Jackson. Jackson, who had been a parishioner at Old North Church, and they didn't know a whole lot about him. And so they asked, what do you, could you find anything out? Do you know anything? And one of the few details they had about him is this apocryphal story. They didn't know if it was true or not, that he had been murdered in a mutiny off the coast of Suriname in 1743. And I was thinking, okay, if he's selling chocolate in Boston, that's why the chocolate shop's named after him. He owned a shop that sold chocolate in 18th century Boston. I said it might be coming from Dutch Suriname. I knew there was cacao production there. So I reached out to a friend of mine at Leiden University in the Netherlands, Carwin Black, who is an expert on all things smuggling and slavery in colonial Suriname. And I asked Carwin, and I said, have you ever heard of this guy, Newark Jackson? And Carwin had actually built a database of all the New England merchants who did business in Suriname. And he queries his database, and he's like, ah, yeah, here's Captain Jackson, something of a smuggler. He shows up a few times in the governor's journal in Suriname, showing up. And so that kind of answered the question. I was like, okay, we answered the question. He's getting his cacao from Suriname. I didn't think much of it until about a week later, when I receive a follow-up email from Carwin, and the subject line is "murder!" exclamation point. And as it turns out, the mutiny was real. And there were quite a few records in the Dutch archives, in the Suriname records that were at that time held at the National Archives in the Netherlands, that detail the aftermath of the mutiny. Two of the mutineers were put on trial, and the ship they had to deal with the ship and the cargo and deal with the fallout of it. And so there's this official record in the Dutch colony of Suriname all about this. And I said, I think there's a lot more here. And so we took stock of what was available and kind of did a small inventory of the records in the Dutch archives. I dug around a bit in the English-speaking world to see what was there, and I found some letters and things like that between some of the Geddy Clark and some other folks. And we then applied in the fall of 2017 for a grant from the Mars Chocolate Corporation. One of their brands is American Heritage Chocolate, and American Heritage Chocolate offers grants to public history groups, museums, and historic sites and things like that, to help them develop programming around the history of chocolate and other just general kind of programming for general programming needs. And it's called the Forrest E. Mars Jr. Chocolate History Grant. And so we thought we had enough to apply for one of these grants and to see where it would take us. And we got it. We got the grant. I was the principal investigator. And that led to us hiring a kind of multinational team of researchers to kind of dig through all of these records all around the Atlantic and start to piece together this story for Old North. So yeah, it's a really kind of very different way of entering this research.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that grant, because for members of the audience who might not be aware of how academic history usually works, getting a big grant to pull together a multinational research team is not very common, right? This is a pretty unusual thing. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that grant, and also about how working collaboratively with other researchers as a result of the grant shaped the book that you ultimately wrote.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it has a profound impact in a number of different ways. And so we received the grant. It was, we put together an application packet. I agreed to be the principal investigator, and we got it. And so I don't know the behind the scenes of what happened, but Mars was very interested in the project, and especially kind of further developing the history of Old North's connections with chocolate and this whole world. So we received the grant, and we actually received then a follow-up grant from the U.S. National Park Service as well, to kind of, so we had a pretty good, it's a pretty well-funded project, especially by the standards of history. I'd say the sciences, of course, no way, but by the standards of history, we got a pretty good amount of money to take care of this, which was good, because we had it was such a broad-based project. When we started, when we initially found these records, and Carmen and I located them, and we started following the people involved, we find people in Suriname, people in Barbados, in Boston, in New York, in London, in Amsterdam. And what this suggested is that there's collections in a lot of these places. And so I was, as the principal investigator, I hired a couple researchers. Michael Bailey, who's a PhD student at Boston College, did a lot of research in New England for me and for the project. Researching, he went to a lot of the private archives in the Boston area. So he went to the BPL, he went to the New England Historical Genealogical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Baker Library, the Harvard Business School, the Boston Athenaeum, and a number of other repositories. And he probably read 10,000 pages of manuscripts, and I would send him back to reread things. Like, are you sure there's nothing there? Like, this name's connected. Poor guy. And then in the Netherlands, I hired a woman named Ramona Negron, who's now a PhD student at Leiden University. and who is one of the savviest archival researchers I've encountered, and she just did an amazing job sifting through all the Dutch records and finding them. She did some translation work because part of the grant was that Old North would use this for programming and things. And so she found a number of records and then translated them for Old North's use. And then I also was able to do some of the research as well, which is exciting. So I was in London at one point for another research trip, but conducted some research at the National Archives and the British Library and National Archives at Kew, and then the British Library in London. I also did research in the public records in Massachusetts. I spent some time at the Massachusetts State Archives, sifting through records and things. And so all told, we built a huge kind of archive of everything related to the Rising Sun and the people related to the Rising Sun that was available. And as it turns out, there's actually even then when the project wrapped up and kind of the fall of 2019, it turns out there's even more that I went back through the Dutch records again with Ramona, and then some more in Boston, and there's even more that we found. But yeah, we built this huge archive for Old Norse use that they are now actually going to be using for programming and things in the future.
That's fantastic, and really relates to the question that I had. The fact that all of this archival material is spread out across so many different sites in the US, in the UK, in Suriname, and in the Netherlands. I was wondering if you could share if there's a particular archive or maybe a particular archival find that you found most memorable or that was your favorite, and why that was.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the things we found were just so fascinating to me, both in the English records and the Dutch records, things I couldn't even imagine like existed related to this one case. But I think what the most significant find came in the fall of 2018 when Ramona was going through inventories related to the ship in the case in the Dutch records, in the Suriname records at the National Archives in the Netherlands. And she came across an inventory for the ship itself. It was just listing, what's like, not even none of the cargo, just the ship itself, like the ship, its sails, the ropes, all that stuff that made the ship run. And at the very end of that inventory were the enslaved children, who I mentioned at the beginning of the program tonight. And that was so significant because it totally kind of changed everything about the project. It changed kind of what the project was going to mean for Old North. It changed what the book that was going to be written, that I was going to produce out of this research. Because looking back now, in retrospect, I think there was obviously some slave trading going on. I wasn't sure how much or how deeply connected, like all the men, I knew the men involved, Newark Jackson, George Ledane, Denny Clark, Edward Tuttle, they all owned enslaved people, and they all trafficked in enslaved people. I just didn't realize it was specific to this case in particular. And like now in retrospect, I can really see that, and just rereading some of the documents I had found before. And so it all of a sudden it changes everything, because now this is not only a smuggling mission, or a smuggling run, it's human trafficking, right? That they're actively transporting people and children at that. And so this find had significant repercussions. And we'll talk more about this later, I'm sure. But for example, this is the thing that ultimately leads Old North to totally reinterpreting their chocolate programming, for example. In terms of the book, it changed the book that I ended up writing. When I dove into this, and especially reading the records related to the mutiny and stuff, I saw in some ways the potential for kind of a true crime, kind of sensationalist thriller almost. That totally changed when I realized what else was happening on board the Rising Sun. When I realized it was a slave trading mission. And so what changed in terms of the book is that the mutiny became the hook. It became the way into this wider world, and not the focal point. So, and what that does then, it allows the mutiny to kind of remain central to the story. It is the story in a lot of ways, without it becoming kind of sensationalized, without it, kind of swerving into the kind of the sensationalizing and trivializing the people who lived and died on board the Rising Sun and their experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you speak about that inventory, because you write on page 71 of your book that, quote, a smuggling ring built upon slavery and human trafficking created a trail of human misery and tragedy, but unfortunately, much of it went unrecorded. So I'd love to hear you speak more about the methods that you as a historian use to try and overcome this lack of records.
Yeah, this was the frustrating part of the research, and any historian of this is the frustration that any kind of historian of slavery will express. I'm sure you know your own work, you've encountered this as well, that you want answers to certain things you just can't get answers to, and there's real limitations of the documents. And the most limitation, the people involved in this case with the biggest limitations were the enslaved people. They appear at one point. They appear in that inventory. So of the 15 we can account for, we only know the name of one of them. One of the young men, his name's Cyrus, and it's listed there. Another one, his name might have been Frank. The other young man, his name might have been Franklin, maybe, if I read the records correctly. And I speculate a bit on that in the book. And so it's really kind of this is really frustrating, because there's more enslaved people on board the ship than there were crew, but I could tell you a lot more about the crew. So who are these enslaved children and young men? And so what I ended up having to do for this part was use context, both the context of the men involved in the smuggling ring, so like Gedney Clark, like Edward Tottle, like George the Dane, look at their slave trading activities, where in Africa they were purchasing enslaved people, their connections in London where they'd be acquiring enslaved people. And I was, through that, able to kind of build a narrative around these enslaved children, because they most likely came from the Gold Coast of Africa, what is today Ghana. And we do actually have the narratives of from the 18th century of enslaved people who had been enslaved as children in Ghana, in that region, and trafficked to the Americas. And so one most famously was a man named Venture Smith, who was enslaved in Connecticut, actually. So we have his narrative. And so while we don't have the experience of the children on board the Rising Sun, we do have his narrative. And a lot of the opinions and things that he expressed, his memories and his experience, you can really see that probably did, in fact, that probably would have resonated with the enslaved children as well, given what we know. And then it also but there were more enslaved people than just the children. The children were what in the kind of cruel vocabulary of the slave trade would have been called remainders. They were left over who hadn't been sold when the Rising Sun first arrived in Suriname in late May 1743. And there's probably a cargo of about 50 or so total, and these were those left over. And so for those who we can't account for, I kind of speculate similarly, like they probably came from this region of Africa, and they would have ended up going to work on a plantation in Suriname, possibly these plantations, given the business connections that we know about. So it was a lot of building out of context, and using the work of other scholars and the work of other enslaved people to try to understand that experience a little better.
Yeah, and I think you do that difficult work really beautifully and really responsibly. Another thing that I really appreciated that you do throughout the book is you reflect on kind of the omissions or the gaps in the archive. And considering those gaps, I'm wondering if there are things that you would have just loved to know, but that eluded you because of the limits of the available archive. Oh,
so much. So much, right? So thank you for that kind comment about the book. Obviously, I'd love to know more about the enslaved trade. I have actual kind of personal details about them, and that's just not possible. But that though, as a historian of slavery, and has written on this subject extensively before this book, while frustrating, was not unexpected. There were things that just really basic facts that I could not find, that I spent hours, right? So, for example, I have no idea how old Newark Jackson was when he died, his age. I have no idea what he looked like, what George the Dane looked like, what Edward Tottle looked like, what Gedney Clark looked like. Eddie Clark died, one of the richest men in the British Empire in 1764. We have no image of his likeness. I have no idea where Newark Jackson was born. He wasn't born in Boston. He moved to Boston in the early 1730s. So just these really basic biographic details that prove so perplexing and frustrating, and it speaks to the sort of nature of the mutiny and the types of records it actually created. So those kind of personal records, right? The Dutch authorities in Suriname are not concerned with getting a total post-mortem on the case. Who were the victims? What were their ages? Where were they born? Right? They're not interested in that at all. They're not even interested in the motive behind the mutiny. There's no real questions about motive. They just assume these men were guilty and they're seeking a confession. That's what they're looking for. And so it's really it's incredibly frustrating because I can narrate the mutiny in just the most gruesome detail, down to like how deep the cuts were on Newark Jackson's body, right, when the mutineers attacked him. Those really gruesome details, and really, in real detail. But I can't answer a basic biographical question about the men involved, or know what they look like. And so my frustration, about being able to talk about the enslaved people actually is applicable to the entire case in some ways. It's just more or less depending on who's involved.
Yeah, and I absolutely share those frustrations as someone who also works on the history of slavery, and particularly in the Caribbean, where so many records are lost or destroyed, as you know.
Yeah.
Another thing that I really appreciated about the book was in your epilogue, you really show how history is constantly being reinterpreted and rewritten, and it's this really living thing, particularly through the example of the staff at Old North Church ultimately deciding to remove Newark Jackson's name from their exhibit and from their chocolate shop, and instead to center the history of slavery and smuggling and how they explained this history. So how do you think that this particular decision to reorient the history of Old North Church intersects with broader movements to re-examine history that we're seeing in the present moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. And there's this kind of we're in a moment of kind of reckoning. I think that's the word you see the most. I use it. That's the title of the epilogue of the book. In fact, is reckoning, and you see it across in the media and across the board being used. And how do we reckon with this past? And and in some ways I'm in an I'm lucky in that as a historian, right? I in my classrooms, I can teach what I want. In my writing, I can write what I want. But public history sites have to confront this in a very different way, because they interact with so many people. Hundreds of thousands of people go through the Old North Church every year of visitors. And and so these sites rely upon certain narratives about themselves. And of course, for Old North, there's two main narratives. It is the Paul Revere Church, right? It's the one if by land, two if by sea. This history of the American Revolution, about the birth of American freedom. This is like a site of that, the site of American independence. In fact, the next day, the shots of Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the War of Independence. After this. And of course, they have a rich history of involvement in the abolitionist movement in the 19th century as well. And so there's these narratives that these sites craft about themselves, that they advertise about themselves. And what this does is, right, it focuses on the history at certain points and in certain moments. And so, right, it's at the time of the Revolution. It's in the 19th century. And what it misses is that Old North Church is, for lack of a better term, it's old, right? It goes back to the early 18th century. It's founded in 1723, and so it has this much longer history. And in that earlier history, it is it's a site for the congregants that go there. These men. They're smugglers, they're slave traders, they are men on the make in the 18th century. I talk about this quite a bit in the book, about the way in which Old North is such an important site of association for the smuggling ring, that these men, Newark Jackson, for example, bought a pew at Old North. George Ledane owned a pew at Old North. And so you can imagine them in the church after services on Sunday, gathering and meeting and talking business, of George Ledane using it as a site to recruit ship captains. to engage in this smuggling. And so much of the profits being made in smuggling and in slave trading are end up going back to the church. In the case of, if you follow Newark Jackson, George Ledane, Edward Tottle, when he lived in Boston, he was a congregator at Old North. William Wingfield, another ship captain involved in the smuggling ring, he was a congregator at Old North. And if you look and when they're donating money, who's donating money to build the steeple, and you see their names show up. Who's donating money? Who's buying pews? Their names show up. Who's donating money to buy the bells? Their names are showing up. And interestingly, the peal of bells at Old North, purchased in 1743 and made in 1744, right after the mutiny, actually. The two largest donors that tied for £100 each donated for the bells was Peter Faneuil, famed Boston philanthropist and merchant, and Gedney Clark of Barbados. That's what the records say, who donated this money, and who's tied for the largest donor for these bells. And so, what is this saying about this institution, this church? It's essentially it's a site of reputation laundering. That these men, by donating money, are they're building up their own reputations. They're creating a system where people might turn a blind eye, even in a world where, say, slavery is ubiquitous, smuggling is ubiquitous and kind of commonplace. They still, right? Smuggling's illegal, for example. So this might cause people to kind of turn a blind eye, because George Ledane's not, he's an upstanding member of this congregation who's donating money. And so it gives them the cover they need to do what they want to do. And so how then do sites come to terms with this? How do they sort of reinterpret a history where so much of their early history and the literal edifice, like the church itself, the steeple, although it's been rebuilt, it was destroyed in a hurricane in the 1950s, but the original steeple, and then the bells, which are those bells are still there. They come from this moment and from this wealth, and how do you confront and reinterpret that, and also to an audience, to a public audience, who, I don't know if they expect that on the Freedom Trail, right? That's the story they're going to hear, and so, yeah, absolutely. You do see, broadly speaking, and Old North is not unique, right? So many institutions in Boston are starting to take stock of their own connection to slavery and ask these questions about how do we change, how do we tell this history? How do we acknowledge this history and whatnot? And for Old North, as you said, they made the move to take Newark Jackson's name off of now they just have the historic chocolate shop. It's no longer Captain Jackson's historic chocolate shop. So they removed his name. There was a commemorative plaque in his pew that's also been removed, pew number 13. And so that's been removed, and now they're building programming around kind of telling this history and telling a much more kind of complicated history of Old North and its connections, as a bastion of both slavery and freedom, right? And kind of how those things are intersected.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about how that history is evolving. I do have some pretty broad strokes questions, but I want to encourage members of the audience to type any questions that they may have in the Q&A, because we'll certainly have time to get to those as well. One of the things that I think really impressed me about Old North Church's willingness to grapple with that history is the fact that, there's a large amount of English language scholarship on Boston and on New England, of course, but it's really only more recently that historians, and this includes you in your earlier work, began to really explore the region's history of slavery and the importance of slavery in New England, which had previously been kind of pushed under the rug to a certain extent. And I wonder how you think understanding these connections helps us understand the history of New England differently. And relatedly, this may give you a chance to talk about any future projects. Where do you think the history of New England will go moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and this has been something I've noticed throughout writing about New England, is that so much of its history is, it's changing. Is the first thing I'll preface it with. It's changing, but so much of its history has been parochial. It's really been focused on these Puritan settlers and their kind of internal dynamics of their community. You know, the towns they built. I mean, the scholarship of the 1970s was just, you know, what New England town was normative, right? And you know, you followed New England towns for generations. You know, talking about Puritan theology and the intellectual history of the Puritans, and especially in New England. And so this kind of very much this study of an internal, like kind of an internal study of this region, its people, who are they're incredibly, especially in the 17th century, they're so self-reflective. They're writing so much, and so it's easy to write these histories where you can think that New England is this place, so this kind of the famous title of a book, it's an errand into the wilderness. It's this kind of solitary errand in the wilderness of these people who settle and they build a new society for themselves. And it's pretty easy, you know, when you're narrating that, when you're thinking about New England's intellectual history and even its economic history in some ways, to kind of seal it off from the rest of the world and what else is happening around it. And the thing is that that isn't the case. That's not the only story. I guess it's part of the story, right? This is important to understand theology and religious developments and things like that. But it's not the only story or the entire story. And so I think the movement now is to try to better understand and situate New England in this wider world, in a wider Atlantic world. And by the way, an Atlantic world looked very different from New England as a whole. One of the ways in which we've kind of written about New England is we write about it as the norm, as normative, right? Like when we think about colonial America, the norm is the Puritan town with its church at the center, and everybody, you know, gets a little bit of land, and everybody worships, you know, largely the same faith. There's little diversity, sort of thing, but that's the exception in this world, you know, where the vast majority of settlers in New England are of European descent. That's not the case when you look at the largest colonies in the Americas in other parts of the 17th, 18th century, where vast majority of the population is actually African descendants, or majority of the population is of African descent. And so what happens is when you start putting New England in this wider context, you see two things. You see how far outside the norm it is. It is a unique place in some ways. But you also see it's the way in which it's deeply interconnected to those places. It's not separate at all, in fact. It's different, but it's not separate, I guess would be the way I would describe it. And so you see, especially when you talk about slavery in New England, it's pretty easy to dismiss the history of slavery in New England. And this is something I've had to fight, you know, my entire kind of career writing about slavery in New England, is it's so easy to dismiss because people would take a look at, you know, the census returns from right before the revolution. They say, oh, well, only 5% of New England's population was enslaved. Yeah, that's true, but it ignores the sizable enslaved populations in the major urban areas and some agricultural areas. But it also ignores the way in which New England's economy was so deeply intertwined with the business of slavery. New Englanders, the export economies built exporting all those towns are producing, all the livestock and salt pork and corn and cider and butter and all that. That's all being exported to the West Indies to feed enslaved people. All that fish, or a lot of that fish, a lot of that timber, it's being exported to the West Indies to support the plantation system there. And so, you know, I think, you know, thinking about like other historians who are writing about this, Mark Peterson at Yale, his book, The City-State of Boston, he has this great line. He says, you know, Boston was a slave society where most of the enslaved people lived elsewhere. And that's how central slavery was to this economy. And so for me, and this book is really, you know, I think my kind of first foray into it was, well, what role do Bostonians play in this wider world of slavery? What role do New Englanders play in this wider world? How are they acting? How are they actors out in this world? If we look at them kind of outside New England, what actions are they taking? What behaviors are they engaging in a world that's largely this Atlantic world that's underpinned ultimately by the enslavement of millions of people of African descent? And the answer is you get men like Edward Tottle, right, who are this agent from Boston who lives in Suriname and is facilitating trade between all the New England merchants that arrived in Suriname and the planters and merchants in Suriname as well. You know, you realize really interesting statistics that, or at least interesting to me, I can't speak for anybody else, but but things like, it's something like 40% of all of Suriname's trade in the 18th century. All the ships that came in, 40% of them were from New England, doing business there. This is the kind of, I think for me, there's kind of, when we think about exploring the kind of future of the history of New England, especially when we talk about slavery in New England, I think there's kind of two paths. The first path is to further dig into the records and kind of explore the everyday lives of enslaved people, and certainly there's a lot of work to be done there still, I think. But there's also this question about the New England's role in this wider world of slavery. And that's where that's where this book is moving in that direction, and where I kind of see my research moving after this. And so for example, I followed one of Edward Tottle's daughters, who married a man named Cornelius Durant, who was a Boston merchant. And Durant, in the 1760s, he and his brother moved to the Danish West Indian island of St. Croix, what is today in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they became timber merchants and planters, and ultimately became revolutionaries. And I can't help but think, does their experience living abroad shape the way in which they behave, not just economically as planters, as enslavers, as merchants, but also politically? Is this behind their sort of revolutionary sentiments? And so these are I think that there's these really fruitful questions we can ask about New England by looking at the activities of New Englanders out in the wider world.
Fantastic. So with these last 10 minutes, we have time for a few questions. We had a very nice comment from Karen Ellingson, who thanks you for introducing her to the story and also to this historical perspective. And then we have a question from Stephen asking how you feel about all of this and whether it's given you kind of a new reference or new perspective, particularly in relation to the enslaved children. And he also asks what you think we should do in terms of, like, do you agree with the decision to remove Jackson's name from the pew? He suggests that those names should be left in the church with a reference to the fact that they participated in human trafficking, so as not to erase history, but rather to live with it. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so to take how did I feel about it? I study this a lot, and even I was a bit taken aback. Like I know this stuff really well, and even I was taken aback when this inventory, it lists 13, and then they use the Dutch words for boys and girls, and the term I'll butcher the Dutch, so I won't try to pronounce it, but the two terms essentially indicate adolescence between about 10 to 14 years of age, is the terms that the two words, boys as well as girls. That was it really did take me aback, because I read and I understood the connections of all this to slavery, especially the abstract connections, right? They're buying the cacao and the sugar and the molasses. It's all produced using slave labor. Like that's understandable. But there was something, and I think there was something so shocking about it. And I think it probably had to do mostly with the fact that I had gotten to know these people involved so well. And even if I didn't think particularly highly of them, and of say someone like a Newark Jackson or a George Ledane, you did know them. And so in some ways I felt like they'd got one over on me for a long time, right? I got to know these guys, and they're also doing this. And how's that possible? How did I miss that? And first of all, how did I miss that? But also just like I was just a bit taken aback, because I felt like I knew those men in a way that they got one over on me, I guess would be the way to describe that. I agree about the Newark Jackson thing, and I believe Ulmer's working towards that, right? So they removed the name from the chocolate shop, I think, because the concern of the historic chocolate programming would have the potential to perhaps trivialize that history, right? I think people who want to go learn about the history of chocolate, they're not expecting to be confronted with this horrific system of human trafficking and bondage, right? They're expecting a very different thing, despite the fact that in the 18th century, you can't separate slavery from chocolate production. But I think there was this, the expectation. So removing his name from the shop makes sense. They are actually working on programming and interpretive signage to kind of better flesh out who Jackson was for the public. but the plaque that was removed was actually commemorative, right? Like almost a celebration of this guy who's one of the first chocolatiers in Boston. So that was removed, and they're going to change the sort of tone moving forward. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and sounds like it kind of goes more towards Stephen's hope for what that would look like, acknowledging that history. We have another question that asks you to kind of reconcile the depth of slavery in New England with the strong anti-slavery movement in the region, particularly in places like Concord and Boston.
Yeah, it is. It's the paradox, right? It's this region that's economy is so deeply intertwined with slavery. By the way, it's deeply intertwined right through the American Civil War and even afterwards, right? You have Bostonians that own plantations in Cuba in the 1850s and 60s, and are deeply invested in, say, Brazil and slavery in Brazil, all the way through the end of slavery in Brazil in the 1880s. And so there is this kind of paradox at the heart of New England, that it is a center of abolitionism, but also a center of slavery. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that for so many people in New England, slavery is a bit of an abstraction, right? That it's something that's far away, and even if they're profiting from it, they're not witnessing it day after day after day. But but it's a little more deliberate than that, and part of it comes out. A lot of what we think about New England and our beliefs about New Englanders' attitudes towards slavery and about slavery in New England more generally, it's purely abolitionist propaganda, right? These things that you've probably heard about slavery in New England. Many in the audience have heard these stereotypes that it wasn't important, and there weren't that many enslaved people. It never took deep root. All of that, those are all narratives crafted by abolitionists in the 19th century as a way of contrasting New England with the South, to show that New England is free soil, morally superior to it. But there's sometimes, New England has its own history of slavery. It was very important to the economy. And so that those narratives are deliberately crafted, as is the process of kind of making slavery something that occurred in the past in New England, that it no longer by the 1790s, slavery is on the wane for a number of reasons, including actual laws passed to end slavery. There's a lot of anti-slavery activism that leads to the end of slavery in New England. So what this allows is for white New Englanders to begin crafting a counter narrative about this place of freedom of abolitionism. But we have to remember, even as that's happening, not everybody's an abolitionist, and most people might be anti-slavery, right? They might be against slavery, but that does not make them an abolitionist, and certainly are not in favor of civil rights for people of African descent. And so what's happening is you have a very wide spectrum of belief, and a lot of people can say, "Oh, slavery is bad. We don't want it. We don't want it here, right? We don't want it in our neighborhoods. We don't want to enslave people." But if it's happening there, we're profiting from it. And you can see there's even if they're pushed on it. So a good example of this is some of the clothing factories that make cheap cloth and clothes for enslaved people in the South. They're questioned, like in the 1840s, like, how can you do this? How can you buy abolition? How can you clothe these support this system of slavery? And the answer is, if we didn't, they would be naked, right? They would go naked. So almost transforming it into like a form of philanthropy. And so there's all sorts of rhetorical tactics around it and around this, and the fact that it's there are a lot of abolitionists in New England. It is the center of the American abolitionist movement, but it doesn't mean everybody was, or even a large majority of the population was. There's just quite a bit of anti-slavery sentiment, and even that doesn't necessarily mean someone is an abolitionist. So.
That's great. I think that comment about the abolitionists creating that narrative in the mid-19th century is a wonderful example of history also being rewritten and reinterpreted. Unfortunately, we are really low on time, so that seems like a nice note to end on. And thank you for such a wonderful and engaging conversation. I really encourage everyone to go and buy your book, because as engaging as this talk was, the book itself is even better, very well written, and just despite the sometimes gory content, really fun to read. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jared and Tessa.
Yeah, thank you all for attending and for having me. Tessa, thank you for hosting. It's a wonderful conversation. I was very excited to be here. Thank you all so much.